Signore e signori, grazie a nome di tutta la nostra comunità per la vostra presenza dall'Accademia Britannica, il nostro centro di eccellenza per ricerche nelle scienze umane, di lettere e delle belle arti. Accogliervi qui stasera ci dà il più pieno piacere. It's a pleasure, a privilege and a joy to have Professor Charles Burdett here with us this evening to deliver the next instalment in the BSR's Wednesday evening lecture series. Professor Burdett will be known to all, if not almost all of you, as a titan in the field of contemporary and modern Italian language and culture. He currently holds a prestigious position as Professor of Italian in the School of Modern Languages at the University of Bristol, where he has worked since 1997. From this West Country base, Professor Burdett spreads his scholarship far and wide in his inimitable transnational style, focusing on modern Italy, but stretching across the Mediterranean basin into the Islamic world to the east. His principal areas of research are Italian culture under fascism, representation of colonialism, travel writing, and theories of intercultural contact. I won't falter by recounting Professor Burdett's impressive 5-page long trail of publications which clogs up the University of Bristol website, but I would like to pause to recommend his most recent book, Journeys Through Fascism, Italian Travel Writing Between the Wars, first published in 2007. It's a very searching and well-researched account of how inhabitants and cultures of other countries appeared to Italian writers and journalists in the 1920s and in the 1930s. Since 2014, Professor Burdett has been the principal investigator on a large and significant grant entitled Transnationalizing Modern Languages, Mobility, Identity and Translation in Modern Italian Cultures. And this is a really important beacon project for the AHRC's Translating Cultures theme. And this is a work that stands as a really important stage for the study of literary and cultural translation, focused on modern Italy, but as a template with very exciting and broad-ranging global implications. Amidst Professor Burdett's many accomplishments, I think it's worth noting also that in his important work for the AHRC and other professional bodies, he is providing a very significant voice for and effective guardianship of his discipline at a time that, it's fair to say, might be a little uneasy for modern languages in the UK. We're very proud to have Charles as a long-time friend of the BSR, where he worked for us for 5 years on the faculty, and it's a very great pleasure to welcome you back here. Tonight's talk, Italy, Islam and the Islamic World, from 9/11 to the Arab Uprisings, is certainly timely and addresses themes that will touch us all. Please join me in extending a very warm welcome to a man whose research excellence, his collaborative spirit and transnational scope epitomizes so much of what we aspire to achieve at the BSR, Professor Charles Burdett.
Well, thank you, Tom, for that very generous introduction. I think I should preface what I'm saying that my main trade is to work on Italian colonialism, to look at its reality of the time, and to think about how Italy engaged across the Mediterranean during the first part of the 20th century, and indeed think about some of the implications of that involvement. But at the same time, I think I don't want to think of my larger career as simply talking about the 1920s and 1930s, but really to begin to address questions that are very current. And so some time ago, I set myself the task of trying to think about the contemporary debate on Italy's relationship with Islam as a stage in a much larger project of trying to relate the history of Italian colonialism and its representation with themes that are current in the present. I've recently published a book which is intended to be introductory to Italy, Islam and the Islamic world, which looks at some of the voices that are heard and which attempts to bring to a British audience some of the debates and questions that are discussed by a whole range of actors within Italian society. It's a preliminary study, as I say, part of a much larger project, which is in part encompassed by Transnationalising Modern Languages, this major grant that we have from the AHRC. So what I thought I would do today is to talk about how I've attempted to frame my most recent study on the topic and some of the voices which I am attempting to engage with. And I want very much to talk about framing, how one can frame an argument and intervene methodologically in this question. The appearance of Islam on the cultural and religious landscape of Italy is a relatively recent phenomenon, and it is one that is related to the migratory flows of the last 20 to 30 years. In contrast with other major European countries, Italy's growing Muslim population originates from a much more differentiated range of countries. The numbers of the Islamic communities are around 1.3 million by most estimates. Most academics agree that over a lengthy period of time, the development of a recognizable Islamic presence within Italy was not something that was clearly visible. Indeed, it was something that for a long time neither the migrant community, or for want of a better word, the host society, was fully conscious of. Though the early stages of the development of Islam as Italy's second religion may not have excited a great deal of comment, the same cannot be said about more recent manifestations of the growing importance of Islam within the public space. Indeed, it is true to say that the emergence of Islam within Italy is a question of crucial societal and cultural importance. There are certainly times when the debate surrounding the issue has become, in the words of one commentator, incandescent. What is certain is that, to quote Renzo Guolo, Islam asks searching questions of Italian society, its identity, its internal coherence, and its likely future. Moreover, any change to the sense of what constitutes the reality of the present brings with it a corresponding alteration to the way in which the past of the country is considered. There are, of course, many ways in which one can look at this question. One can, for example, look in detail at the ways in which the media has confronted the issue, from La Repubblica on one side of the spectrum to Libero or Il Giornale. An example of this work, a very good example, is Marco Bruno's L'Islam Immaginato of 2008. What I've attempted to do with my book is to present, through the examination of a range of events and issues, some of the most significant voices that have made themselves heard in defining Italy's relationship with Islam and the Islamic world. To look, in other words, at the nature of the arguments that they adduce, at the connections between different positions, and at the depth of the fault lines between opposing perceptions. Methodologically speaking, the study applies the techniques of literary scholarship. It looks at the nature of the voice that the author employs, at the recurrence of metaphorical constructions, at the evocation of emotion, at the manipulation of genre. While many of the texts that I have looked at are written by well-known authors such as Oriana Fallaci or Tiziano Terzani, I have attempted to apply the procedures of textual analysis to a body of material that extends well beyond what would ordinarily be defined as literature. I've tried, in other words, to analyze works that might be defined as reportage, social commentary, or more simply as fact-based publications. I've attempted to see texts, whatever their pretensions to the objective or the referential, as cultural practices of signification. My aim has been to trace ideas across different genres and to place a series of voices in dialogue or in contrast with one another. The purpose is to uncover the conceptual structure on which the arguments are based, to consider the understanding of culture that informs the judgments that works formulate, to look at the constructions of alterity that operate, or otherness, that operate within the writing, to look at the structure of feeling that underlie the works in question. Part of my study has been to look at how cultures, with their identity-supporting structures, shape notions of selfhood. That is, how authors reflect on the degree to which national, religious, and cultural modes are internalized and made subjectively real. Indeed, a dialogue of selfhood engages with always a negotiation between the external and the internal. The external is the guardian of consciousness, at least according to the work of Peter Berger and the social construction of reality. Related to this question is how writers see personal identity as fixed by cultural formation, or how far they see, to quote Paul John Eakin, self and self-experience not as given, monolithic and invariant, but dynamic, changing and plural. Autobiography, travel writing, foreign correspondence, all posit different ways of writing about the self. By analysing how the conventions of each genre are exploited, one can gain a clearer understanding of how the writing self is enmeshed in what it contemplates, or to take a metaphor from the work of Clifford Geertz, how we are, how human beings are part of the webs of signification that they themselves create. In a way that is perhaps less straightforward, but nevertheless as important, by looking in detail at how the techniques of self-writing are manipulated, one can begin to see how the written self, with its perceptions, memories, processes of ratiocination and emotive responses, is used as a theatre in which issues of enormous political, social and cultural importance are explored both intellectually and affectively, thus promoting an understanding of events and circumstances which, despite whatever claims to objectivity are made, is nevertheless filtered through the self's apprehension of its own psychological mechanisms and its own location within a complex discursive environment. There are many examples that can be used to illustrate this point, but a good one would be the writing of the journalist, writer and more recently politician Magdi Cristiano Alam, who began writing for La Repubblica in 1979, becoming one of the first journalists in Italy to write seriously on the increasing importance of Italy's growing Muslim population. But in 2003, he moved to the Corriere della Sera, assuming the title of Vice Direttore ad Personam. He has maintained a status as a public intellectual, as a figure of high media prominence, who is not employed to present the interests of a particular group within society, but who exercises a role of someone who asserts the independence of his opinions, who is outspoken in his views, and who is, in his own reckoning, prepared to reveal uncomfortable truths to those who occupy positions of power. He is adept at exploiting the resources provided by new and traditional media for making his voice heard in a national debate and engaging with large sections of the public. He's particularly interesting because of the spectrum of positions that he has occupied, from, as I say, La Repubblica through the Corriere to a position that is much more controversial. And of course he is important also for his very public conversion to Catholicism. Yet, even the most cursory consideration of the titles of his books that have been published over the last 10 years, and the books that have very significant circulation figures ranging from around 100,000 copies, indicates the importance of the autobiographical reflection in his work, something that is generally not considered, since his works, like works that are not explicitly literary, tend to be read in terms of content. Yet, as I say, if one begins to analyse their titles and indeed the supporting structures that occur in his work, I think it's quite revealing. He writes, for example, Vincere la paura, la mia vita contro il terrorismo islamico e l'incoscienza dell'Occidente. Io, 2005, a work in which he is overtly critical of the statements that are made in Fallaci's books. His subsequent text, Io amo l'Italia, ma gli italiani la amano, of 2006. Viva Israele, dall'ideologia della morte alla civiltà della vita, la mia storia, of 2007. Grazie Gesù, la mia conversione dall'Islam al cattolicesimo, of 2008. Europa cristiana libera, la mia vita tra verità e libertà, fede e ragione, valore e regole. Now, all of these texts, though would not necessarily be the object of literary analysis, can open themselves to a complex analysis of their discursive structures. And I think this kind of work is very important, especially considering the prominence that he has assumed over a lengthy period of time as a public intellectual. Yet, my purpose has not simply been to deconstruct the constitutive elements of one voice or another, and to provide, by so doing, an assessment of its relative importance. My aim has rather been to add to the depth of our knowledge of the debate that is occurring in Italy by placing the various voices that have made themselves heard in counterpoint to understand each voice, that is, as it functions as part of a dialogue. A good deal of writing on autobiography insists on the importance of the relational in any narrative of identity formation, how the self relates to significant others, to social constructs or conceptual models of subjectivity, is key to understanding the deep subject of autobiographical discourse. A major concern of my study has therefore been to examine the grounds for understanding other people that are posited by writing which is predominantly in the first person singular, by looking in depth at the strategies that are deployed to represent the self's relation to the other. The study attempts to interrogate the nature of the boundaries that people set up between themselves. And boundaries, of course, are subject to agency, and they are not static, but susceptible to continual, everyday change. But if we begin by looking at elements within the articulation of anti-Islamic feeling, the sociologist Stefano Allievi draws attention to some of the alarmist declarations made at the beginning of the century by important members of the church, most notably Cardinal Biffi's statements on immigration in September 2000, and opinions put forward in the secular world by figures like Giovanni Sartori. Biffi's opinion, on which a great deal has been written, was that government policy on immigration to Italy should privilege those religions which could supposedly be integrated most easily within Italian society. But he points, above all, to the extremist rhetoric, this is Allievi, to the extremist rhetoric of the Northern League and the demonstrations of Islamophobia that have taken place in a series of small towns in the heartland of the party, which Allievi believes are, or should be, subject to very serious anthropological investigation. Clearly, the events of the 11th of September gave a particular impetus to a current of anti-Islamic feeling. As Ahmad Abd al-Wahili Vincenzo writes in his narration of the plan to build a mosque in Naples at the beginning of the century, Poi venne l'11 settembre, come un uragano, come una nemesi storica. Il mondo scoprì di colpo e dolorosamente quello che purtroppo noi sapevamo già da tempo. Dal fondamentalismo era nato ancora una volta il mostro del terrorismo islamista, Islam e terrorismo, un binomio destinato a radicarsi nella mente di molti occidentali, facendo dimenticare le prime vittime di quel terrorismo erano stati proprio gli stessi musulmani, quello di Algeria, d'Egitto e tanti altri paesi. The current of anti-Islamic feeling that has been expressed most prominently by the writings of the journalist Oriana Fallaci in the early years of this century, they occupy a continuing relevance in Italy in the status that she has achieved as someone who putatively predicted recent terrorist atrocities. For example, a recent text that has been published and widely circulated is Fallaci's, a collection of Fallaci's writing. She died, of course, in 2006, Le radici dell'odio, la mia verità sull'Islam. Also, this is the text that is currently available in many Italian bookshops. There is currently also the text by Vittorio Feltri, Non abbiamo abbastanza paura. So I think it is worth looking at some of the central propositions of this work, which has a very considerable afterlife. The first part of what is now generally known as the trilogy on the significance of the terrorist attacks of the 11th of September was initially published on the 29th of September 2001 in the Corriere della Sera. But very shortly afterwards it appeared in book form as La rabbia e l'orgoglio. The subsequent two texts of the trilogy explored the expansion of the Islamic world through migration, the responses of various European governments to the question, and the likely effects on the development of Western culture in the longer term. Within 2 years of its appearance, La rabbia e l'orgoglio had sold over 1 million copies, while the third book in the series sold over 500,000 copies on the first day of its publication. La rabbia e l'orgoglio is the best-selling work of non-fiction in Italy. Now, that being the case, I think that it poses very serious questions of anyone who works on transnational themes in Italian studies. Indeed, many other analyses of global culture in the wake of the attacks on the Twin Towers that have been published in Italy, of large circulation, have been written as reactions to the views that are expressed in the trilogy, and there are many. In his response to the publication of La rabbia e l'orgoglio, Stefano Allievi speaks explicitly about the need not only to refute Fallaci's ideas, but to do so in a way that is as direct, as personal, and as accessible as the trilogy undoubtedly is. The trilogy not only collapses distinctions between different parts of the Muslim world, Muslim majority countries, it also sees every Muslim as the product of a radical version of Islam, or Islamism, and as a consequence complicit in the furthering of an anti-Western ideology. It is Fallaci's claim, again in La rabbia e l'orgoglio, that the mosques that have recently appeared across Italy are brimming with terrorists or aspiring terrorists. I quote, obviously. The conception of Islam that is present throughout the trilogy, and which is set forth explicitly in the preface to La rabbia e l'orgoglio, is that as a religion and as a civilization, it represents an unmoving body of thought and belief, which structures human identity in a way that is relentlessly hostile to the West. What the trilogy argues is that fundamentalism is not a separate reality, divorced from the central current of Islam, but the expression of a central characteristic of Muslim world. Fallaci does not simply maintain, to use the distinction that is made in Samuel Huntington's work, that there is a clash of civilizations, again a concept that has an important afterlife between Islam and the West. Her assertion is rather that it is the aim of the Islamic world to undermine and colonize Western societies by changing their demographics and undermining their systems of value. There is, without doubt, a basic Orientalism at the heart of this thinking. Fallaci creates, in Edward Said's terms, a division between the West and the East, between the familiar and the strange, and she asserts with uncommon vehemence the superiority of the former to the latter. But whereas the majority of the writings that Edward Said examined in Orientalism set out to produce a vision of the East as a place that legitimated Western imperialism, the notion of colonialism works quite differently in the trilogy. Instead of suggesting that putatively different levels of civilization necessitate the West's role in the East, the trilogy is devoted to the idea that a reverse form of colonization is occurring without the West even noticing, and this connects with a very strong current within this particular identity writing that I'm talking about, and that is the decline of the West. And there are all sorts of parallels that historically one can draw in the way in which this writing is perhaps implicitly rehearsing debates from a much earlier period of time. It is the contention of the trilogy that the Islamic world is essentially violent not only because of its supposed hostility to the West, but the extremity, again putatively, that it protects its own series of values. She writes, "Oggi la conquista è di tutt'altra natura, è una conquista religiosa, culturale, più che occupare il territorio, mira ad impadronirsi delle anime con principi che non sono i nostri principi, concetti che non sono i nostri concetti, costumi che non sono i nostri consumi." Every word in that quotation needs to be systematically analyzed. It presupposes a whole series of givens about what constitutes we, what constitutes the West, what constitutes the idea of the conceptual underpinning of any society as it is lived and negotiated. She presents her readers with a terrifying picture of a world in which the collectively recognized frame of reference, the social structure in which ordinary life is led, has been radically subverted and transformed. Within this, it is not the destruction of established social structures, but the loss or estrangement from personal identity that is presented as an object of fear. Within this construction of contemporary Islamic identity, those responsible for the terrorist atrocities are equated with all adherents to Islam. The fear that events of 9/11 are the prelude to something much worse are projected onto the figure of the Muslim. And Magdi Alam's engagement initially with this is very interesting because he exposes the virulence of these ideas. The Muslims assume the attributes of everything that is outside Western notions of rational, normal, or civilized. In short, the Muslim as he or she appears in Fallaci's writing is possessed of, to adapt a phrase from the writing of Slavoj Žižek, a phantasmatic dimension. Though Fallaci does not acknowledge this, the fury that is directed is not aimed at individuals, but more at a faceless figure that appears as the embodiment of her most deep-seated fears. Real or imagined dialogues are essential to the way in which this thought works. But her work exemplifies a dialectic that Judith Butler, in her work, sees as typical of reactions to the way in which we believe, to reactions to the terrorist attacks of September 2001. Namely, the tendency to think of and address others in a way that we believe that we are imagined and interpolated by them. The dialogue in addressing a spectral figuration which we attempt to quell is at base a very distorted mode of rhetoric. But it also alerts us to a question that is of very topical importance, and that is the working and functioning of fear as it exists in the psychological realm of the individual and as it is transposed to the collective. It also alerts us to the question of borders that separate self from other, how they operate at their most profound and even unconscious level. Indeed, the American literary and cultural studies scholar Janice Radway, picking up on a contention made by the sociologist Avery Gordon, argues that we should see the unconscious less as something that is enclosed within the subject, and much more as the life of others and other things within us. Certainly, psychological criticism plays a very important part within any literary studies approach, is something that is necessary if one is beginning to look at some of the deeper structures that operate in this work. Part of what I've attempted to do, with reference to the theoretical work of such well-known critics and philosophers as Judith Butler, Martha Nussbaum, and Adriana Cavarero, whose work, Horrorism, is of fundamental importance, seeks precisely to examine the nature of the emotions that are generated by those who are perceived to belong to traditions of thought, belief, and behavior that are considered to be other. What I've looked at is the intricate construction of people's identity that are present in textual representations, and to consider the mechanics of stereotypical definitions of otherness, but also to concentrate on how certain forms of writing do not seek simply to convey a purely intellectual knowledge of other people, but to suggest how we might move beyond that to a much more instant form of recognition. If the debate surrounding Italy's changing demographic and cultural reality, and more generally the complexity of the country's relation with the Islamic world, has been characterized on the one side by the expression of extreme anti-Muslim sentiment, then on the other side one finds, needless to say, the articulation of much more nuanced and informed views. While referring, for example, to the furore that accompanied the pronouncement of Cardinal Biffi, Renzo Guolo indicates the more sophisticated and constructive interventions of other high-ranking figures within the Catholic Church, in particular Cardinal Martini. He points to the fact that Catholic associations are at the forefront of initiatives designed to welcome migrants to Italy. He points to John Paul II's promotion of interreligious dialogue and Martini's insistence on dialogue and integration as the way forward, while of course acknowledging that within the Italian Church there is a profound discussion of the Church's relationship with Islam, which he dates from the Second Vatican Council in the 1960s. And the debate has meant that there has been a growth in texts that have sought to provide more knowledge about the working of Islamic communities within Italy. Contributors to this debate include such academics as Renzo Guolo, Stefano Allievi, but also the historian of medieval Italy, Franco Cardini, journalists like Khaled Fouad Alam, the author of the text Islam Explained to the Northern League, from a different perspective, Suad Spy, head of the Association of Women of the Moroccan Community, Sergio Yaya Pallavicini, the Imam of the Al-Walid Mosque in Milan. Clearly then, the writings by these figures are involved in the complicated business of attempting to change fairly entrenched ways of seeing. They are engaged in the endeavour to present a firmly grounded and informed picture of the Islamic communities in Italy, rather than a fearful projection of an imaginary Islam. They are also, very interestingly, writings which attempt to reflect upon, and indeed to change, the way in which we think of ourselves. And indeed, what is the meaning of ourselves? They exemplify the point made by Tiziano Terzani in his collections of essays, Lettere contro la guerra, in which he argues that the world culture has been irrevocably altered by 9/11, and that if we are attempt to confront the challenges caused by such a traumatic paradigm shift, then we must attempt to change our own sense of interiority. This is in the shadow of what Baudrillard defines as the purpose of terroristic acts, namely to produce psychic effects that cannot be matched by the subject's habitual response mechanisms, and therefore translated into a phenomenon that is confined by the rational processes of the mind. or Derrida's comment that terrorist events inflict enormous damage on the experience of the everyday as something that is repeated and which therefore can be anticipated. The danger that we face, to put Terzani's point differently, is of being locked into a collective imaginary of which we ourselves will prove the victims. Or to quote the work of Joanna Burg on fear, of being in a world in which the spectre of the terrorist takes on a godlike power and where authoritarian, indiscriminate and disproportionate responses become the norm. In order to avert this danger, Terzani argues we need to develop more sophisticated notions of how cultures work and indeed how consciousness itself operates. And if one were to look at, for example, the representation of the war on terror, I think there's a great deal which one can say, working from scholars like Mitchell and Redfield, on the way in which the correspondents on the war on terror have represented their experiences. I don't have time to do anything other than give a brief overview of this kind of writing, and rather than focus on individual authors, I want to concentrate on three themes. Firstly, landscape, secondly, people, and thirdly, temporality. But just to present some of the images of the figures that I'm talking about. If one is talking about the change in the physical and cultural landscape of Italy, then clearly one of the most important issues facing many localities is the construction of the mosque. And here the recent work of Maria Bombardieri is very important, because it's an empirical and intensely researched debate about the different Islamic communities in Italy and the questions confronting the building of mosques or sites of worship in Italy. Debate over the issue has now become so intense that one has lost sight of one of the essential nature of the question, and that is the Muslim community, in common with any other religious grouping, has the right to build its own places of worship. This is enshrined in the Italian constitution, and it is not a gift for the state to bestow. Writing on the subject is important because it reveals many issues that underlie this question. For Stefano Allievi, one of the reasons that the mosque is important, and he, through a tour of Italy, which is both travel writing and indeed sociological analysis, written in the early part of this century, talks about the mosque and its status as a place of worship. It's important because it indicates the increasing visibility of Islam as an internal actor within Italian society. In one of his books, he narrates his journey, charting therefore the changes to the country's urban landscape and telling the stories of how a particular mosque has been constructed, whether that is in Palermo, Catania or Milan. Charting the change to the physical appearance of a place, in other words, becomes an opportunity to reflect on its symbolic significance. It is also an opportunity to consider how individuals or groups of people interact with the surrounding environment that is in continual change. His writing enhances our understanding of the intricacies that underlie the establishment of the physical presence of Islam in Italy. And I think a very good example of this is his discussion of the Grand Mosque in Rome. Building work started in 1984, but it was not completed until 10 years after that. Its symbolic significance, has assumed for different communities at different times and in different contexts, is the subject of his analysis, and also that of Maria Bombardieri, also its relationship with Muslim association. Within the Catholic community, Allievi documents how the building of the mosque was originally interpreted by some as an undermining of the status as Rome as the home of Catholicism, though he concentrates on the way in which, for mainstream Catholic opinion, the mosque has more readily assumed the status as an indication of inter-religious dialogue that was promoted especially in the latter years of John Paul II's papacy. What is interesting about his analysis is in the way it reveals how a space of enormous significance can be used to mean different things, and also how it not only reflects but anticipates developments in society. The same phenomenon is viewed by Yaya Pallavicini, but from a different perspective. What he does is to describe the building of mosques in various parts of Italy from the inside, gathering together direct testimony of those involved. The different narratives that he collects are intended to demystify the process through which such sites are constructed. The different voices that one hears through his texts point to the problems faced by those attempting to appropriate places of worship. At the same time, he explains the reasons why it is necessary for there to be proper religious structures and proper representation for the needs of a community which is in need of cultural, judicial and linguistic orientation. In his view, the lack of an authoritative Islamic entity, officially recognized and composed of Italian Muslims, has impeded a dialogue with the state, and often meant that the absence of such an organization, the establishment of places of worship, is often left to the initiative of individuals and private associations. And indeed, this debate lies behind the attempt a few years ago to set up la Consulta del Islam Italiano. In his view, the problem is not integration, but fundamentalism, and the lack of the structures that would facilitate the organized support of the Italian state accentuates the question. But one of the most important things about the stories that Allievi, Pallavicini and others narrate is that they are about everyday concerns and life events. They indicate the distance from most members of Italy's Islamic communities from any form of Islamist ideology. To that extent, therefore, they attempt to produce a more everyday, less political image of Islam. And it is indeed on the everyday and on the question of agency that some of the most interesting work is currently being produced in Italy, of which more in a second. If one is talking about the way in which we see one another, then this is clearly an area where creative writing has a role to play. In the words of the American philosopher Martha Nussbaum, it is the role of art and literature to disrupt ethnographic views of culture and its development, and to problematize thinking that sees cultural identities as oppositional. The practice of seeing oneself from the outside, or indeed through another's eyes, promotes both a critical attitude towards oneself and an appreciation of one's own culture, not as isolated and static, but as necessarily plural and in a constant and unstoppable process of flux or transformation. And this is where it is important in any cult discipline to talk less about the national and much more about the transnational in all its articulations. In his work, a very celebrated work, Todorov, in The Fear of Barbarians, does not simply advocate a degree of personal intellectual development, but explores the means through which it is possible to promote a greater understanding of cultural difference within one's own community. As Todorov writes, and fear is a constant issue in texts of this type, if fear is allowed to act exclusively as a guide, it almost always produces disastrous results. It encourages the use of disproportionate force. It justifies behavior that would otherwise be regarded as inhuman. It risks creating dangers in the future that are more terrible than those that are confronted in the present. One can ask, to put this point differently, how the cognitive apparatus of literature is used as a means of gaining greater understanding of the way in which fear of other people and other customs works to condition perceptions and responses. One can explore the effectiveness of literature in revealing the interiority of the individual, the complexity of the interaction between thought and emotion, and the changes of perspective that occur in everyday settings and circumstances. One can also look at the kind of psychological and perceptual world in which the reader becomes involved, and ask what effect this kind of involvement is likely to produce. By asking these questions, though they are distinct yet related, one can move closer to an understanding of the importance of literary representation and its reception within public debate and within the context in which culture develops. And as a researcher on Italian literary and cultural representations, then clearly this is an element of great importance in the study of what we think of as Italian culture. And I would argue that recent Italian literature is a fascinating object of study precisely because it contains a number of works that confront static and polarized visions of Islam and the West. The question of people who share the same space but who are from separate communities, how they view one another, and how their perceptions are to some degree determined by preconceived ideas, and how these perceptions are in turn complicated by emotional entanglements of various kinds, represents the basis of a whole series of works by writers such as Amara Lacous, Randa Ghazi, Yunis Tawfik, or indeed Alessandro. Sorry, I'm catching up with myself in my PowerPoint slide. So some examples of mosques in Italy, Colle Valdelsa in particular, a site of considerable contestation. This is Bologna. Here we are, as Mara Lacous, Randa Ghazi, and the text I want to talk about very briefly is Amara Lacous is Divorzio all'Islamica. The story, roughly speaking, follows a new recruit from the Italian Secret Service, Christian, as he is tasked with infiltrating the Arab Muslim community of Rome and exposing what is believed to be a well-advanced terrorist conspiracy. The suspense that the reader feels is driven by the question of who, among the many characters that populate the scene, is compromised and whether Christian will uncover the actors within the conspiracy before it is too late. We read, in other words, the action of the story with a series of expectations. As the central protagonist becomes embroiled in one situation after another, we ask whether he will succeed in making the correct inferences or whether his identity will be revealed with possibly fatal consequences. Thus, the idea of surveillance is built into the framework of the narrative. The purpose of the novel's major character is to spy upon a community and convey everything that he sees to his superiors, who in turn relate everything to events occurring on a global scale. Thus, the world of the novel is necessarily a world dominated by suspicion, while in a more subtle but equally important way, the identifications that the central protagonist makes, the relationship that he establishes between what he sees and what he believes he is seeing, acts as the motivating factor of the story. It becomes clear that the narrative logic is driven as much by the emotive interaction of the characters as by any attempt to fail a terrorist attack. The text is clearly interested in the way in which perceptions are altered by emotional attachment, but the real innovation of the novel is the way in which it questions the framework in which judgments are formulated and the stability of the identities of those who make them. But the most important character in the novel is not Christian, but Safia or Sophia, the Muslim woman with whom he forms an emotional attachment. The purpose of this character at a purely thematic level is as a device for exploring the way in which identifications are made by one group about another and how they are experienced. She functions, in other words, as a means of drawing out the intellectual and emotional consequences of framing Muslims according to a series of stereotypes, or of tracing what Peter Mori and Amina Yakin describe as the restricted, limited ways in which Muslims are stereotyped within the political, cultural, and media discourses of the West, and how behavior, the body, and dress are treated not as cultural markers but as a kind of moral index, one that confirms a non-Muslim sense of superiority and cements, in their words, the threatening strangeness of the Muslim other. Through the eyes of Safia, Lacous presents a picture of how easy it is for people to see frightening figurations in one another's everyday appearance. The novel is attentive to the power of the media to influence the way in which people are seen. As she tours her world around Viale Marconi, Safia is made aware of the inferences that people draw about her identity and the attitude of suspicion that people assume in her presence, an attitude that she rationalizes by seeing her appearance as haunted by the spectre of jihad, guerra santa, kamikaze, 11 settembre. Spectrality and hauntology are basic to the novel's structure. The everyday is haunted by visions of the past and the future, and it opens itself very much to the writing of Derrida on the spectral. The subtlety of the figure of Safia or Sophia lies not only in the way in which she reveals a network of corresponding attitudes, but also in the way in which she provides a means of exploring how, in the context of frequent hostility, a sense of personal identity is continually shaped and reshaped. Or to put this point with slightly more nuance, the depiction of her character serves as a means of investigating how the individual internalizes the pressures that emanate from the external. One of the remarkable features of the novel is that the action that it portrays is driven forward to a large degree by the changes of the two central characters' consciousness and self-perception. If we were to rely on the slightly more technical language of Stuart Hall's exposition of the problems of conceptualizing identity in a post-structuralist mode of thought, then we would say that both central protagonists are representations of a subject in process, and that they offer a series of insights into the nature of subjective self-construction. If one accepts that the idea of personhood is constructed in relation to dominant social structures or discourses, then Safia, as the title of the novel implies, the most important body of learning and belief that she relates to is her Islamic faith, and much of the novel is an exposition of concepts within that. The second text I want to refer to is Randa Ghazi's Oggi forse non ammazzo nessuno, which is not so much a novel as a fictional autobiography. Yasmin, the 23-year-old Italo-Egyptian narrator of today perhaps, finds herself confronted with stereotypical images of her own identity. She is dismayed by the monstrous distortions of extreme right-wing portrayal of the Islamic world, and dismayed that they are not obvious to everyone, and she finds herself under constant necessity of defending who she believes herself to be against those who, in her words, defame that which I represent. The act of defending who she is in a series of everyday interactions with people, or to use the subtitle of her work, through a collection of storie minime di una giovane musulmana stranamente non terrorista, encourages at one level a longing for an identity that is less complex, while at another, more profound level, it leads her to develop a fully conscious understanding of every aspect of that identity. The writing suggests the speech patterns of its protagonists. It is lapidary, ironic, and colloquial. It mixes the narration of humorous incidents with stories of personal relationships and incidents of stereotyping and discrimination. In her portrayal of Yasmin, Ghazi dramatizes the intellectual and emotional complexity that lie behind a series and a sense of belonging to a group. Both Lacous and Ghazi use their protagonists as a means of exploring how individual agency operates in a variety of contexts. They are concerned with how individuals do and do not identify within religious and cultural structures. They are concerned, in other words, with how an individual's internalization of a given subject position involves negotiation, accommodation, resistance, performance, and intergenerational transmission. If, as Hall maintains, individuals use the resources of history, language and culture in the continual process of becoming rather than simply being, then literary figurations like Yasmin or Safia are a means of exploring that process. The two characters display how stereotypes function at the level of everyday perception. They show how imaginary borders operate between people and how they are experienced emotionally. But the two characters, in the intricacy and hybridity that defines their identity, exemplify the absurdity of the stereotype as a mode of cognition. I want to conclude on one final theme. A large part of the interests of the texts that I've been talking about is to be found in the way in which they suggest how we might avoid being caught in the traps or snares of interpretation. Their success, or otherwise, resides in their ability to encourage new ways of thinking. If they seek new perspectives on the present, then they also seek new perspectives on the past. The past is an area of conflict, and how you interpret history defines how you read the present and how you anticipate the future. And here I think it's worth commenting on a couple of points that emerge from a series of texts that the historian and commentator Franco Cartini has written. The first of these is his denunciation of the clash of civilizations theory. Though he does criticize the idea as an appalling oversimplification, his essential argument is that there has been no centuries-long clash between Christianity and Islam. Even going back to the 12th or 13th century, he regards the instance of military conflict as isolated phenomena within a continuous economic, commercial, and cultural relationship. The second point, which is closely related to the first, is that it does not make any historical sense to talk about Islam as a stranger to or as an intruder into Europe. He asks whether one can define as foreign a culture that has in the past dominated parts of Europe, which has communicated to us some of our most basic elements of our knowledge, and which has been Europe's economic and trading partner for centuries. The third point that he makes is that in its assumption that it represents the best of all possible worlds, the West needs to interrogate itself, for it expresses its own sense of ethnocentricity and, one might add, its own sense of messianic time. The view that Cardini is putting forward, with all the eloquence that one might expect from a professor of medieval history, is present within the writing of other figures, though in their work that view is articulated slightly differently. For example, Allievi, in narrating his journey through Italy, is travelling through time as well as through space. In travelling from one part of Italy to another, he's often struck by the physical evidence that Islam has been an internal actor in Italian society for centuries. He finds that architectural and symbolic evidence of an earlier Islamic presence in parts of Italy is astounding, whether that's in Sicily or in Bari or in Lucerna. Similarly, Fuad Alam makes a journey to Palermo, where he discovers the extent to which the fabric of the city is imprinted evidently and uncontestably by its Islamic past. By asking different questions of the past, one sees the present in a different perspective. Most obviously, recent migration from predominantly Muslim-majority countries can be seen as a return rather than as an event without precedent. Alternatively, a greater consciousness of the density of the connections between Italy and the Islamic world leads to the discovery of rather striking historical phenomena. It is, for example, significant in the 1930s, and here I get back to what I defined as my main trade, that Mussolini was prepared to define Italy as a bridge between Europe and the Islamic world and to present himself as the protector of Islam. Sorry, this is again, I'm sort of catching up with my slides since I'm going slightly quicker than I intended. This is a text by Alessandro Perissinotto. and referring to a recent study along the lines that I've been indicating, especially in its discussion of the everyday and agency, which unfortunately published after I'd finished my text by Renata Pepicelli and Giovanna Accocella, is particularly a sociological and cultural study which enables one to analyse literature from a variety of very sophisticated theoretical perceptions. So, to return to looking at the past, if one thinks of Mussolini as the protector of Islam, and we might see texts of the present, such as that by Domenico Quirico, who speaks with a great deal of authority on recent events in the Middle East. But if we look to the past, then the idea of Mussolini as the protector of Islam is something that assumes a very important contemporary relevance, especially when one considers imperialist plans in the Middle East during the 1930s and early 1940s, where a map of where Italy might have extended is something like this. Through a variety of strategies then, all these texts, though talking predominantly about the present, challenge a monolithic idea of Islam and its meaning, but they also engage us in thinking about time, temporality, and the relevance of the past and its meaning as we construct a future. Overall, one of the aims of my study has been to promote a certain kind of interdisciplinarity, but another necessarily has been to encourage a reflection on what it is that we are studying when we study Italian culture. Though it may be tempting to think of Italian culture as in some way self-contained, separate and distinctive from other cultures, the reality, one could argue, is that it is continually defined and redefined by its interactions with social and economic phenomena from across the globe. To pose the question of Italy's relationship with Islam is to engage with connections and entanglements that are not additional or separable, but essential to the identity that we define as Italian. And I think this work on the transnational is an important development in contemporary studies within the discipline. I'd just like to conclude, since we're talking, I'm referring implicitly to the Translating Cultures initiative in which I'm involved, a phrase by Judith Butler, writing on 9/11 in her a very important text, Precarious Life. She writes, "It should not be surprising to find that there are racial and ethnic frames by which the recognizably human is currently constituted. One critical operation of any democratic culture is to contest these frames, to allow a set of dissonant and overlapping frames to come into view, to take up, in other words, the challenges of cultural translation." And I'll stop there.
Thank you very much indeed, Charles, for that very scholarly and illuminating account of all these different voices and counter voices that act so importantly in this debate, the greatest cultural
Well, I think the connection with Libya is extremely important, speaking historically about Italy's position. It was the subject, indeed, of a closed-door meeting at the British School some years ago. Italy's role in international politics lies rather beyond my competence, but certainly there is a question about understanding, or a generalized understanding, of Italy's importance as a colonial power in Libya over more than 40 years, and also the long period of decolonization in Libya. And I think there is a question for people who work on colonial or post-colonial studies in finding the means in which to talk seriously about the way in which that experience is very much part of an Italian identity, which indeed predated fascism. The invasion of Libya is in 1911. So I think the ways in which one can develop a knowledge of Italian involvement in Libya, whether through textual representation or indeed through film, is something that is certainly a duty of literary scholars, artistic production and literary production. I think there is a lack of historical consciousness of all the ramifications and influence that this period has. For example, very famous film, The Lion of the Desert, on Graziani's repression of Libyan resistance, was something that was not shown in Libya, shown in Italy for many years after its production. And I think there is a need to talk about the relevance of that period of history in all sorts of forms, especially also considering, I mean, there's a great deal of semiotic analysis to do on the meetings between Berlusconi and Gaddafi that occurred some years ago before the events in Libya to do with the Arab Spring. In particular, because the resonances of the past and the payment of reparations of Italy to Libya went on for a very considerable amount of time. And indeed, when Gaddafi came to Italy, he came with a photograph of Omar al-Mukhtar, the hero of Libyan resistance to Italy, pinned on his chest. So I think that kind of cultural analysis has been done in part, but there is a great deal more to do. And I think, you know, when I was talking about my recent study and the way in which I want in time to integrate this in a much wider vision of how the present is in some way inflected by Italy's colonial past, that is one of the questions that I think it would be very important to discuss.
Thank you for that. I was just wondering, okay. I was just wondering, in some ways it sounded like, I'm not really sure what the difference is between many of that like right-wing literature, like Fallaci, like Vittorio Feltri. I'm not really sure how that's any different from what Trump is saying in America now, and just like in general anti-Islamic feeling in the West. What is that particularly Italian about that?
Yeah, no, good question. I mean, certainly as an advocate of the transnational, my response would be twofold, in the sense that certainly there is a transnational commonality of anti-Muslim feeling that one can trace across many countries. And indeed, I think there are research projects to urgently investigate how ideas do not remain conditioned or confined to one cultural space or another, but how they travel. Fallaci has, of course, been translated into English. The text, she was living in New York at the time in which she published them, so it really doesn't make sense to talk about her voice as exclusively Italian. So I do think one needs to look in depth at the way in which ideas circulate and how they attain different inflections, but as you say, also how they have a kind of an afterlife. What Trump is saying at the moment, the idea of barring entry to America to Muslims and so forth, should be the object of cultural analysis at a very deep level, rather than taking the intervention simply at the level of content, appalling as that is. But there are, more specifically, Italian elements, or elements that one can perhaps link to an Italian experience or an Italian perception of history. I think it's very significant in the work of Fallaci, for example, that there is part of the significance of Fallaci is the authority with which he spoke to an Italian public, the sense that this is a person of tremendous appeal, a person who has pursued a whole range of initiatives that many would have seen rightly as very progressive, not least her feminism. And I think looking at the reception of her texts, and Francesca Orsini writes about this, is the tremendous sense of betrayal that many people felt on the publication of her books, that someone's an icon of the left in many respects is talking a language that is so assimilable by the right. And that in itself is a question of serious cultural interest, the question of reception. There's also another level, I think, within Fallaci's writing, in that the way in which she talks about opposition to the Islamic world is framed almost constantly through an idea of resistance to totalitarianism, resistance to fascism. Her identity as someone through family traditions, through a historical political engagement, has resisted totalitarianism and is prepared to resist that again. So I think some of the interventions that have criticized Fallaci talk very much about the way in which there is the security of her location as anti-fascist, yet in some ways the kind of discriminatory rhetoric with which he engaged is in some way struggling with an unacknowledged continuation of thoughts and perceptions that are common to a much earlier period. So I think one can and one should look at the different sfaccettature with which she articulates her position. The national and the transnational are two sides of a coin, and they cannot be separated.
Thank you very much for this really kind of thought-provoking talk, and I cannot help asking you to just maybe add like a few words on the last slide, because of course one of the various things which comes to my mind is that if this slightly, kind of at least slightly unrealistic idea, which like many other such unrealistic ideas from Italy at the end of the 1930s, or the 40s, would have actually ever happened. This ties in with racial laws.
Yes.
Of course, because as we know, they started with the conquest of Ethiopia and the fear of miscegenation. So, I mean, I think that's very interesting, and I really would be happy if you could actually say a few words about this map. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. The uncovering of this map, or a whole series of maps, is, and I should have acknowledged this, and I do elsewhere, is by a friend of mine, Amir Arielli, who's worked in Manchester, or works in Manchester. And he's written an excellent book, which I reviewed relatively recently, on Italian fascism and the Middle East. And he's done a very in-depth historical analysis of planning in the, especially looking at military archives in relating to the early period of the Second World War. So this is only one of a whole series of absolutely fascinating perceptions of what the Italians thought they would achieve. And indeed, this is related to the Islamic policy of the regime, and it takes it so much further. The idea of Mussolini is to use Islamic, or largely Islamic troops for the conquest of Ethiopia, which he did, especially drawn from Libya and Eritrea, and to construct a military force that would be drawing on reserves from Italy's newly acquired colonies. And therefore the whole rhetoric about presenting fascism as a model of modernity that Middle Eastern societies could draw from. Within a map of this kind, you're right absolutely to point to its rather crazy nature, but that craziness is culturally located. It's part of Italian fascism as world creation, as a utopian ideology with an inverse temporality, which is looking backwards to the Roman Empire, while at the same time producing an idea of a vision of the future that is inflected by an idea of the past. It has a millenarian context, it has an eschatological context. The trouble is, of course, that it is presented as purely rational at the time, which I think develops, and this is an argument that Nia makes in his book, about the way in which, in the latter part of fascism, rational understandings of what is possible give way to very clearly utopian and extremely destructive ideas of what is actually realizable. But it is something that I think one does need to try to see, or attempt to see a longer temporality as a way not simply of learning about the past, but seeing how the past inflects our present, and indeed looking at discourses that are relatively unknown. Nia is the first to uncover these maps and talk about their cultural connotations, because it has a clear relevance to thinking especially about right-wing ideology. If you think of Mussolini as the putative protector of Islam, that is significant.
Yeah, I have a question about the various narratives produced in...
Sorry, I didn't hear that, Federico?
Yeah, no, I have a question about the various narratives produced in the last years, fictional and non-fictional. Is there a geographic distribution in the sense that, for example, are there more, how can I say, Islamophobic narrations in the north rather than in the south? Or, yeah. So I just wanted to know about the geographic distribution of those narratives, and yeah, if there's an impact on their content.
Yes.
Yeah, and the storytelling, let's
Sure,
put it like that.
I think, as I say, I was keen to talk about the limitations to begin with the type of analysis that I've attempted to do, and to really be clear about my disciplinary identity. A literary scholar at base, moving to cultural studies, and at the same time asking myself questions about the contemporary relevance of the kind of study in which I have engaged for a very lengthy period of time, and to open up a new chapter in my own research, but also to talk about a matter for a largely British audience, and certainly of Italianists, to alert us to the questions of enormous topical importance, and to provide some kind of opening for studies that are being produced in this period, and to bring them into consciousness of the Italian community working in the British Academy. So in terms of an interdisciplinarity of a methodology, what I'm attempting to do is show an opening to works of sociology and the kind of empirical work, empirical and theoretical work, that is very important and which is entirely necessary if we're going to abstract a series of texts from the corpus of Italian literature. We need to be able to ask the questions that allow serious cultural analysis of those texts. Thus, I have been attempting to engage very much with works, particularly emanating from the Padua School of Sociology, Stefano Allievi to begin with, Maria Bombardieri, who's written a fantastic text, Moschee d'Italia, that provides all this kind of information, the numbers of the places of worship in Italy, the frequency of their geographical disposition across Italy, and indeed how that kind of sociologically oriented study can be, at least we can be aware of from a disciplinary perspective, and hopefully writing from a more literary or cultural perspective, one can contribute or participate in contributing to at least one small part of a vast jigsaw. And I do think questions of these of this moment require different disciplinary perspectives, and indeed ask for large grants in order to bring those disciplinary perspectives together. So, referring to the work of Maria Bombardieri, the reality is that the majority of the Muslim community is more in the north than the south, in particular, and she gives figures for the Veneto, for Lombardy, and so forth. There is also the question of the Northern League in Italy, and she discusses in great detail the controversies that have occurred in the construction, say, of the mosque in Colle Valdelsa, the plans in Turin and Geneva, and so forth. But that's not to say that there is not opposition to in the south. And for example, I quoted a number of perceptions on the intention to build a mosque in the district of Ponticelli in Naples, and there is an extreme degree of Islamophobia, as well as support from the local authorities for the building of the mosque. Indeed, Iervolino was at the time mayor, I think, of Naples, and indeed the kinds of description that occur, that shortly we would see her in a burqa and so forth, is something that is defined. But I think, yes, definitely the interaction between literary scholarship, the analysis of text, and an opening and an attempt to make scholarship of that kind part of the way in which we address text is, I think, certainly see part of my work. And indeed, I referred at the end to the work of Pepicelli, Acquacelli, which unfortunately I've come to rather late, but I mean it provides a whole series of ways in which one can address text by Tawfiq, Lacroix, Randagasi, because it provides the kind of context with which one can see the operation of a text of that kind. So I think that's a kind of roundabout way of defining how I come at interdisciplinarity.
You'll remember that Pope Benedict got into terrible hot water some years ago when he made a speech in Germany during a visit to Regensburg when he was the professor there, about the association between Islam and violence, and he was very careful. He quoted a 12th and a 13th century Byzantine emperor saying there had always been a connection between Islam and violence, and this brought down coals of upon his head, and there were riots in several places when his words were reported in the Islamic world. I just wanted to know if you had any comment on the attempts by the Catholic Church, by the Vatican, since that time to improve relations with Islam and to try to lay the ghost of Islamophobia.
Yes, I mean, I think this is a question of enormous importance, and I think I refer in particular to the works of Renzo Guolo in his understanding also of the attempt by various political parties to appropriate an idea of Italian identity and a very restrictive notion of who has the right to talk about Italian identity as Christian identity. I mean, this is very problematic discourse to make, but people do make it. I mean, they're thinking, for example, that many who criticize the Lega Nord notice the way in which a certain idea, a construction, an invention of tradition is appropriated by a secular party, which involves the appropriation of a Christian heritage. And I think that is entirely problematic and actually right for people to expose. And this is what very much the late Khaled Fuad Alam did in his book Islam Explained. The League was precisely to talk about the way in which the modern political parties are very keen to attempt to claim that they are in some ways the inheritors of an Italian tradition stroke Catholic tradition. Within the church itself, I think there are, of course, a variety of opinions, but as I said, or as I alluded to at least, the idea of interreligious dialogue is something that is enshrined in the Second Vatican Council, and it is something that has was very much at the forefront of John Paul II's papacy. Subsequently, I think there is a greater openness, certainly, towards inter-religious dialogue, but one has to see the strength of Catholic cultures in all its articulations, in particular the charitable work that it accomplishes, especially through the work that it does with migrant communities, as being characterized by very considerable openness towards Islamic culture and are trying to avoid any kind of distinction between, or attempt to say that there are lines of communication that cannot be established. But it also depends on particular individuals and their their perception of local conditions. For example, opposition to mosques can, in some sense, be defined by what is the role of a mosque, what is the nature of its position, whether it is integrated to a community and so forth, and individual members of the church do play a part in that. For example, there's a great deal of discussion about the building of a mosque in Bologna. I showed you a slide of the present place of worship in Centro Islamico in Via Pallavicini. There, I think the opposition is in part to, has involved the church. Rughi, I think, is the bishop there, and his opposition is very nuanced, but it is present. So I think one would have to talk about a whole series of currents and individuals, but generally speaking, I think there is considerable openness towards interreligious dialogue. Moving on from the very famous statement that was made in Regensburg.
Did you want to do one final?
Thank you. Your analysis was rather complex. I have but understandable, even though I can't agree with what you said about Fallaci, but that's something that we can discuss privately. My question is that, do you feel that Italy is more accommodating to Islam as respect to what goes on in, say, Great Britain? One thing, I don't want to forgive terrorism in any way, but I wonder if you have considered, and I don't think you mentioned it, that what happened after the Twin Towers in the United States, the military actions, the military invasions of places like Iraq, Afghanistan, the upset, throwing out Gaddafi, all these things I don't think have in any way encouraged, or actually I think I should say did encourage violence. Thank you very much.
I think the question, very broadly speaking, when we're talking about the perception of Islam in Italy or indeed anywhere else, is a question of a failure to recognize the tremendous diversity of Muslim majority countries and indeed Islamic communities. I think it is necessary to draw very sharp distinctions between Islam and Islamism and different articulations of Islamism. And I think the problem with right-wing or non-progressive views is it's the static nature of its interpretation of Islam and the failure to recognize that Islamic communities are among the victims of terrorist activity and extreme ideologies. If one were to look, for example, at some of the writing by Malise Ruthin or John Gray in particular on Al-Qaeda and what it means to be modern, is a devastating critique of the way in which to associate Islam with radical Islamism really does not recognize the fact that many Islamist movements take an enormous amount from the West and indeed totalitarian ideologies with their utopian thinking. So it doesn't make sense to talk about them as anything other than transnational configurations of ideology, at least in the words of Britain's leading philosopher, John Gray. So I think that question of modernity is very important in the way in which one should always be attempting to draw conflations between an extremely variegated, diversified idea of Islam and a very simplistic notion of associating Islam with terrorism, which is, of course, what various voices do. And I think that is where the writings say of someone like Franco Cardini, who's able to talk with great sense of historical temporality, is very important, because we need to think in a much wider context if we are to understand the articulation of what Islam means, and also to get beyond the distinction between the West and Islam. Islam is part of the West. There is, and it doesn't really make sense to speak in any other way about that. One also needs to talk, especially following writers like Stefano Allievi, about the distinction between a certain notion of Islam that can be perpetuated through a conflation between terrorism and Islam, and the way that that can operate through certain ideas of the media, and the everyday inevitable hybridity of cultures and movement. Islam, to take a view of Allievi, should not be considered as a photograph, but much more as a film in constant movement, in common with any other religious affiliation or community structure. So I see what you're saying, but I think the whole thing is about how we understand distinctions and how those distinctions are mediated through the way in which various works and voices are articulated. In response to your other question, I think very much the question is about disproportionate response, and responses that in some way actually make matters worse. In the writing, for example, of Mitchell on cloning terror, important work about the war on terror, and indeed by members of the White House. Richard Clarke, for example, and his devastating critique of action in Iraq, is to talk very much about how responses, when they are disproportionate, can indeed make matters far worse, but also that there's a danger of not considering the whole intellectual question of what we mean by the West and the Islamic world. And these are figures, very close to power, who make these assertions. So also, yes, Italian responses to the war on terror. I mean, I've looked at a number of these, in particular the writing, for example, say, Lili Gruber and her various very high circulated texts on the war on terror, I miei giorni a Baghdad, for example, or L'altro Islam. I mean, they are all about trying to understand the complexity of the West's response to the threat of terrorism. I think the final point is that recent work on ISIS, of which Domenico Quirico, who I cited very briefly, is one, but also works like on the British media, for example, like James Coburn writing for The Independent, or indeed Loretta Napoleoni, who writes in English and is based in America, talk about ISIS as the words that she uses to talk about a kind of Frankenstein that has been invented by disproportionate Western action in Iraq. Now, I would not be qualified to make statements of that kind, but these are statements that one finds they're made by extremely respected commentators. So I think your point about disproportionate reaction being very much part of the equation is, I think, very well made.
Well, thank you all very much for being here, and especially thank you to Professor Burdett for that really thought-provoking and sophisticated analysis. It's very useful analysis indeed. And I invite all of you, speaker certainly deserves a drink, but invite all of you who have not renewed your Lenten vows against drinking alcohol to come upstairs to the foyer for a glass of Prosecco and further discussion. Thank you very much.
It's very complex. I went to an exhibition at the Macro Museum in Viennese